So you have lotion. That's a good idea. My hands were cracking.
Yeah, I found, so I have this beard oil that I have rarely used for moisturizing one's beard, and it turns out to be fantastic for these chapped hands.
Hey everyone, this is Catherine LaSota. I'm the founder of LIC Reading Series. It's a monthly event that I started in April 2015 in Long Island City, Queens at LIC Bar, and we just turned 5 years old. And on the occasion of our 5-year anniversary, we are doing a series of alumni conversations, writers who have read at the series but not together, bringing them together in this show with Literary Hub Virtual Book Channel. So our writers are going to read briefly from each other's work and then discuss each other's work. And today we have Paul Lisicky and Alexander Chee. And I will briefly introduce Paul and Alex, and then we are going to hear Paul read from Alex's work, and then Alex will read from Paul's work. We are going to have a great discussion. I can't wait. Thank you guys both so much for being here. So we have Alexander Chee is Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth College and author of the novels Edinburgh and The Queen of the Night. And his essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, was published in 2018. Paul Lisicky is the Associate Professor in the MFA program at Rutgers, and he is author of Unbuilt Projects, The Burning House, Famous Builder, Lawn Boy, The Narrow Door, and his memoir, Later, My Life at the Edge of the World, was just published in March 2020. And I want to say Alexander Chee was at the LIC Reading Series for our 1-year anniversary on April 12th, 2016. And Paul, you were there just 1 month later on May 10th, 2016, ships passing in the night, if you will. But now we have you guys together, and I can't wait to hear Paul read from Alexander Chee's book. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Catherine. It's so great to be here, and I'm excited to read a passage from Alex's essay, Imposter, from How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. One Saturday morning, a month after moving in, I went to the elevator, and when the doors opened, there was Chloe Sevigny standing against the back wall. I am not easily or often starstruck, but I had loved her ever since Boys Don't Cry, when in the course of a single movie, she became, to me, one of the most important actresses of my generation. Now here she was. Her eyes were level, focused on some middle distance, far from anything in the elevator shaft. She was wearing spectator pumps and a white Burberry Prosom trench coat, belted, the collar up. A hapless-looking skinny boy, his arm covered in sleeves of tattoos, accompanied her. He was dressed in a trucker hat, expensive jeans, and a wife-beater shirt, and he looked around in dismay as if there might be some hidden exit in the elevator he could use, if only he could find it. The elevator descended quietly, and somewhere around the 10th floor, she said, without looking at him, "Did you give them my name?" He said nothing as the elevator descended. I remembered it was Fashion Week. The Marc Jacobs show was that morning. She was likely on her way, though it could have been anywhere, anything. "Did you give them my name?" As she spoke each of these words, they were wrapped in fire, hanging in the air, perfectly timed to the floors flying by, the last said just before the elevator finally stopped. Her companion still said nothing. The doors opened, and she flew off through the lobby, those spectator pumps flashing and echoing on the marble floor as he chased behind her. I never saw him again. Her, however, I saw regularly. The elevator was soon like a little theater of her. The doors would open and she would be there, sometimes dressed very elegantly, sometimes in a tank top and Daisy Dukes, a bottle of Woolite perched on her hip, go into the basement to do a little laundry. It was the best ad Woolite never had. She soon would nod when she recognized me before the doors closed again, but I never intruded on her, never spoke to her. We continued like this until one day in the lobby, as I got my mail, the concierge, a sweet older woman who I think had decided she didn't care that I was living there illegally, said my name. I went over to her. Alexander, Chloe here is interested in seeing the apartment. She understands it is for sale. I turned. There Chloe was, looking at me expectantly. I don't remember what she was wearing, but then because my mind went white, it still seems to me she is more beautiful in person or on film than in photos. Something happens across moments with her that isn't apparent in a still. Is it for sale? She asked, her direct attention blinding me. I tried to stay calm as I answered, yes, it is. I remembered a warning from my friend. Do not show the apartment on your own, she had said to me. Only the broker shows it. But this is Chloe, I said to myself then. I decided to disobey my friend exactly once. Alex, I just so much love your portraits of strong women, not only in this book, but throughout your work. And I think about Chloe being so physically present here. I think about the description of the Daisy Dukes, her tank top, but in this particular passage, it's that that bottle of Woolite, the bottle of Woolite perched on her hip. And I think about these women being so fully realized, and they're centered, they're kind of possessed of an animation and energy that feels hard won. And I love the fact that the speaker wants to maintain some distance from Chloe here, but also, Chloe's a possibility for his own self-realization. And I wondered if you could say a few words about, the role of women in your work.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And it was such a pleasure to hear you read that scene and to think about both when it happened and then the construction of it and the writing of it. I think, I have always had a strong women in my life, and so I suppose it seems only in some ways ordinary to write about them and to try to do well by them as a result, and just women in general as both figures in the stories and essays that I write, and then also in the writing itself. So I don't excuse me, I think maybe what ends up happening is that it ends up standing out in my work, possibly just because I think people don't. There's something that a lot of my women friends have described over the years that I know is true, which is the way in which, as a woman, you can vanish to a culture once you reach a certain age, or if you're not sexually desired in some way. And so people don't maybe take the same energy and care to tell stories about you in that case, or to describe you. So I wonder if that's part of it. I mean, I'm happy to think that I'm good at it, but I think also that maybe other right are just not doing what they should do.
Right. Yeah. I'm sort of curious about what you might have cut out of Imposter. Like what didn't end up in the theater of this piece, because it's so succinct. Every scene, every sentence is really contributing to the whole. And my gut feeling as a reader is that you don't, as a writer, get to this place without working with more, without having, the luxury of cutting. Is that hard to answer?
Not so hard to answer. I think, I didn't include, for example, the moving in and the moving out exactly. What it was like to bring my boxes and furniture into that space, and then when I was leaving to bring those things out, and to have the feeling of smuggling my life, in a sense, in and out of the building,
Right.
because it was, a co-op building where you weren't supposed to sublet without the permission of the co-op.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not very exciting. Maybe it is. Maybe it would have been. Maybe I could have made it exciting. The other things that aren't in there maybe are the sort of the way every day went through this kind of this roller coaster of belonging and not belonging, which I describe in some ways, but the pleasures of the place aren't the same as being grounded in a place. I was having this kind of, it was like a joyride in an apartment. Like, as I say in the essay, the apartment was this, for those who haven't read it at home, the apartment was this, I think, 1,000 square foot apartment or something like that on the 19th floor of this building at 3rd Avenue and 19th. And it had views across 3 sides of Manhattan, from most of the apartment. And it was the kind of place that you always imagine that you'll live in when you move to New York, before you discover that almost no one in New York actually gets to have that kind of apartment. And so I had this feeling of living on borrowed time. I was being charged the maintenance because the apartment was for sale. It had just been for sale for a while. And so there was always every day this feeling of like, don't get used to this, because if this is what you expect for yourself in this life, you will be very unhappy.
Love the description of the friend who draws a box in the air and says, imagine $1,000 in this box, and now multiply that by 579, and that will get you this apartment that Chloe has described as cheap. So that image has always stuck with me. I love the way you physicalized it, and I love the wit around that. Could I just ask you one more question that, like, I'm curious about? I mean, I hope this follows from what I just asked. What are you working on next? What are you working on? Nonfiction or another novel, or are there more than one project in the works?
I write a bit like a gardener, so I have many things that I'm working on at any given time. And so right now I have the rough outline of another essay collection, for example. And it's a mix of essays that are finished and have appeared elsewhere, and essays that are unfinished, and essays that I'd like to write. And I'm applying for some grants right now to try to finish that book. I'm working on a kind of, I guess I'm calling it like a social realist novel set on Mars, which has been a lot of fun to think about. And And then I also, last winter, excuse me, I published an excerpt from another novel in progress through Amazon Selects. And that story is called The Weddings. And it's a part of a larger novel that right now, it's had several rough titles over the years. The current title for it is The Prince. And it's about it follows the life of a Korean American gay man from 1985 to 2025. And it's inspired, I think, by E.M. Forster's Morris and by Alan Hollinghurst's The Stranger's Child. So it's sort of following the ways in which his relationship to his sexual identity and his identity as an immigrant and Korean American have shifted over 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
That sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. I have to say, I don't know if you wonder about this or even know what is going on with that apartment now. Who's in that apartment?
So I do know that it was bought by someone who was a superintendent for a school nearby. And I hope they are very happy there. It certainly would be a great place to ride out quarantine, I think. Yeah. That's about all I know about it.
I think that what you gave us in Imposter is what I want to know about it. So that's all I need to know about it. Can we hear you read from Paul's work briefly?
Yes.
Great.
With pleasure. So this is Paul's memoir, Later, My Life at the Edge of the World, which is created in a kind of pointillist style where all of these discrete small sections with separate titles are gathered to accumulate into this larger work that I found in particular very interesting, actually, as I work on my own new novel for the way that it charts some of the changes in how we think about gay identity, queer identity, AIDS, and ourselves as gay men. I love many sections of this, but I think today I'm going to read from in the first part of the book, which is called 1991 to 1994. This is chapter 2, and I'm going to read 2 sections here. And the first one is, I think we can say it's about Provincetown. Utopian. If you're lucky in your life, a place or two will be offered to you. That place won't be where you were born or grew up. It will be at some distance, and it will never be yours. You'll always be a visitor or guest. The trees will smell like rain. They might stay green all year, or their leaves might start browning in July, as cool weather comes soon to these parts. Animals will be nearby, some of them in those trees, or right out in the open yard. The air will taste of ocean, negative ions churned up by the surf, or be so hazy your eyes will tear up and burn on sunny days, and you'll be fine with that. This place will give you things denied you in your place of growing up. Company when you're in need of it, solitude when you're exhausted by careful, polite conversation without jokes. It will make you feel smarter than you are. It will make you younger, sturdier, more flexible in your joints and muscles. People treat each other better here, all of them, at all levels. And maybe there aren't even any levels, all the old ways we used to divide and rank one another. The lives of animals are important too, not for human use, but for themselves, in themselves, complex societies that care about their communities and want to stay alive as much as you do. You love this place like a person you can't stop making love to. You dream about this person when they're right in front of you. You move through its streets and paths aroused and alert. You can't get that mischievous smile off your face. You want to put your hands on it, that place, that whole place. You have a secret, and isn't it lucky that everyone else on the street shares that secret with you? Wanting. In pictures from that time, it looks like my body and brain aren't speaking to each other. Certain parts ignore the other parts. And the ribs, lats, obliques, the shallow channel above the tailbone, they don't believe they matter. I expect clothes to do all of the work of identity, as practically everybody does. In the era of AIDS, clothes are enormous. They function as armor or drag, they bestow power, but also swallow up whoever pulls them over their heads. Maybe the greatest taboo involves drawing attention to the body, as so many are losing theirs, waking up to find their wrists thinner, chest marked with spots and scale. And yet my longing to stand out through a pattern or a color is so strong I can't help but get it wrong. Pent-up desire makes me a little nuts. It makes me porous, warps my perception. Weird words come out when I don't expect them to. Desire flushes me with shame, the kind of shame I want to rub out of my skin until it relaxes. The real me is not here, but in the future. And yet I've done everything possible to prolong childhood and delay adulthood, or to make sure that future doesn't happen. I've gone from grad school to grad school, slept with 3 guys before I was 28, and that's all about HIV, the fear of, too simple. I didn't hold you enough when you were a baby, said my mother the evening before I left. We sat at the kitchen table, shucking corn into a brown shopping bag. Immediately, she looked like she wanted to take it back, even though her face also said she was giving me a gift, an act of tenderness she tried to pass on but couldn't. For a second, I felt it pour through me. Everything is explained. But then the room felt warm, too warm. She'd given me power over her by letting out a deeper secret. She was afraid of me. Even when I was a 10-pound baby, my mother was afraid of me.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. I chose utopian in part because I think a lot of us are trying to think about how we are going to live better than we are living now. How the current pandemic has highlighted in some ways how inevitable the pandemic was because of the structure of our lives under late capitalism currently. And I've been thinking a lot about how, back in the 80s and 90s when I was, demonstrating with ACT UP, one of the main chants was healthcare as a right. That was one of the things that we were trying so hard to advocate for back then because we already knew the cost of for-profit healthcare in our community. And so it was interesting to think about P-Town in that light, which is of course an idealizing light. The idealizing light of the newcomer. I think for many gay men, myself included, Provincetown is kind of like that guy that you hook up with on the regular and never quite manage to date.
That's a perfect metaphor.
I wondered, as you were putting this book together, I guess, how much, so you were writing this obviously before the times we're currently living through. How much of that wisdom, if that is what it is, came up for you through the writing of it? Like how
Yeah.
much of the way you thought about the town and our community?
There's something about that particular period in the early 90s that has always situated itself in my imagination as really present. And I have friends with whom I've talked about those years again and again, just to keep those stories alive. And it's not even been a willed act, but we were living, everyday survival was so acute. And I always wanted to give shape to that experience because, after some years had passed, I knew how rare that that sense of aliveness was. And so as I did begin the book, it wasn't simply an act of dredging or recovery, but I found myself asking questions of those experiences and of those interactions. And in many ways, it was a fresh interrogation. I was learning a lot as I was writing the book. And I think that learning ended up fueling me. It kept me going. I'm not sure I could have written about this time. It would have been too oppressive if it didn't feel like the book was being powered by this act of discovery. So it's like sort of doing two things at once. It's trying to recover this lost era, but also to think about it. And I wanted to write something that at least attempted to honor the long-term damage of that pandemic on our emotional lives, even as situations have changed again and again and again since the early 90s. I still feel so much shaped by the fear of my own intimate expressions being so endangered and costly on so many levels.
I think one thing in the second section that I read that I found really powerful was the memory of how we were so afraid of ourselves back then as gay men, and afraid of our bodies, afraid of what our bodies desired, afraid of each other. And I think you did such an incredible job at mining that and really describing what that was like, because I think it's very easy in the current moment where we have more rights than we had then. We have more literature. We have we have the capacity for intergenerational conversations that we've never had.
Right.
And I think it's easy to lose some of those details. And so I wondered how you went about, how did you find that again? Or did it just all stay with you?
Well, I think I simply wanted to write what I hadn't seen written before. And I imagine that fear is something that on a certain level I'm still contending with, even though, whatever fear I have now is not nearly as extreme as it was back then. But, I don't think we really lose our past selves as we get older. I mean, I feel like this brain is still a container for my 25-year-old self and my 35-year-old self, and et cetera. And it's all kind of stacked in there. And one of the things I wanted the book to do was sort of like tear down usual boundaries around how we think of aging, for one thing, and how we allow boundaries to divide so many aspects of our cultures and communities. What would happen if I wrote a world that felt more porous? And is there something to teach a reader by introducing that reader to a porous world where we at least ask questions of all the markers we've constructed to make human consciousness and human experience understandable and if not easy, but sensible.
So I know at this point you are a practiced memoirist and essayist, and in fact, I noticed that there was a kind of experience described in this book that was also described in your previous essay collection, a sort of makeover that you kind of gave yourself, but that it was attended to also by friends in the town. And I think we have had so many of these, like the makeover story in popular film is really well known to us. I don't know if the gay makeover is as documented, and that was a total pleasure. Yeah. But there's also, in relationship, you talk about like how clothes were doing the work of identity, and I do remember being a very cynical 20-something in the Castro in the 90s and watching people come into town with a credit card and like go to a store and just like buy a whole identity and then have it like the next day, because at a different like books, I saw them when they were unprocessed immigrants, if you will, from their heterosexual communities that they were escaping from. Arriving into the Castro and Kazan, you're a leather queen, and Kazan, here's your hankies, here's your rainbow keychain. So do you have any of those clothes? Like, how did you document yourself and these changes? Like, or have you gotten rid of all of them?
Oh, I still have them? That's a good question. I have new versions of bandanas that I bought for the pandemic that have not been successfully worn around my face because they slip. So I don't think the fabric is thick enough. But yeah, that's such a good question. I still have my Carhartt trucker cap, which manages to look good across time. I mean, it still looks as fresh as it did back then. Yeah, like certain. I'm thinking of. I had like a Woolrich plaid, like black and red checked wool vest that I have somewhere. It's in a box somewhere. But yeah, it's interesting to think that some of the Butch articles from that era have managed to I don't know, to speak across time and in some way never go out of style.
The thing that I'm wondering now is what were there any books that you were trying to write something that you hadn't seen before, but were there any books that guided you in the writing process, books that you admired or were inspired by?
Well, I mean, certainly I took in the books of my ex, Mark Doty, on Provincetown. I mean, not only his books of poetry, but at least two of his memoirs, which are situated in Provincetown, and I saw those books come into being. And then there was also Michael Cunningham's Land's End, which is a short book about Provincetown. And I mean, I think I metabolized that work as I was working on this book. But I also wanted to say, like, well, how can I complement those books? How can I extend the conversation by writing about what those books weren't able to cover back when they were written, in the early 90s? So yeah, I'm sure there are other books as well that I'm not conjuring up right now, but those two writers did a lot to inform my starting place.
Mm. And what are you working on now?
I've been working on a book about my late father for about 4 or 5 years. And for a while, that book sort of sat inside later. They were kind of intertwined. And there's a little bit of my father in later, but he ended up moving off to the side. So he wants his own container, and I'm still trying to find a shape for it. I have this feeling that the current moment, this current pandemic, is going to be folded into that book. I don't know how it couldn't be, because my brother keeps sending me articles about his particular care center, where I think at least 30 people have died within the last week or two. And the people, not only patients, but people whom we probably knew. And yeah, I'm having a hard time separating the two. And I know we'll probably all be writing about this pandemic. I've sort of stopped myself at first thinking, well, who's going to want to read about this in, the 2 or 3 years after this is over, when a book is ready. But honestly, this just feels like the condition of life. And it's not like we're writing about the pandemic as much as we're writing and thinking about the questions that isolation and survival summon up in us. And not to mention all the horrible politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to thank both of you so much for coming together now during this very difficult time to talk to each other about your amazing books, because they deserve attention regardless of what we're going through. And I also was really struck that you both, the way that you express details, and how we started talking about Paul's items of clothing that he still has, and we started with Paul talking about that bottle of Volite on the hip. It's like those details mean so much. And that you both chose to read sections that focused on a specific place, really being so important during a particular period of life. So I found that as a through line with what you both chose to read. So thank you. Thank you for this. And thank you for being our second episode on this virtual book channel show with LIC Reading Series. I wish you both health and lots of good sleep.
Thank you, Catherine. Happy anniversary to LIC Reading Series.
Yes. Happy LIC. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
Say bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.